Knowledge, which is at the start or immediately our object, can be nothing else than just that which is immediate knowledge. Knowledge of the immediate, of what is. We have, in dealing with it, to proceed to, in an immediate way, to accept what is given, not altering anything in it as it is presented before us, and keeping mere apprehension free from conceptual comprehension. The concrete content, which sensuous certainty furnishes, makes this prima facie appear to be the richest kind of knowledge, to be even a knowledge of endless wealth, a wealth to which we can as little find any limit when we traverse its extent in space and time, where that content is presented before us, as when we take a fragment out of the abundance it offers us, and by dividing and dividing seek to penetrate its intent. Besides that, it seems to be the truest, the most authentic knowledge, for it has not as yet dropped anything from the object. It has the object before itself in its entirety and completeness. This bare fact of certainty, however, is really and admittedly the abstractest and the poorest kind of truth. It merely says regarding what it knows, it is, and its truth contains solely the being of the fact it knows. Consciousness on its part, in the case of this form of certainty, takes the shape merely of pure ego. In other words, I in such a case am merely qua pure this, and the object likewise is merely qua pure this. I, this particular conscious I, am certain of this fact before me, not because I qua consciousness have developed myself in connection with it, and in manifold ways set thought to work about it, and not again because the fact, the thing, of which I am certain, in virtue of its having a multitude of distinct qualities, was replete with possible modes of relation and a variety of connections with other things. Neither has anything to do with the truth sensuous certainty contains. Neither the I nor the thing has here the meaning of a manifold relation with a variety of other things, of mediation in a variety of ways. The I does not contain or imply a manifold of ideas. The I here does not think, nor does the thing mean what has a multiplicity of qualities. Rather, the thing, the fact is, and it is merely because it is. It is, that is the essential point for sense knowledge, and that bare fact of being, that simple immediacy, constitutes its truth. In the same way, the certainty qua relation, the certainty of something, is an immediate pure relation. Consciousness is I nothing more, a pure this. The individual consciousness knows a pure this, or knows what is individual. But when we look closely, there is a good deal more implied in that bare pure being, which constitutes the kernel of this form of certainty, and is given out by it as its truth. A concrete actual certainty of sense is not merely this pure immediacy, but an example, an instance of that immediacy. Amongst the innumerable distinctions that here come to light, we find in all cases the fundamental difference, viz., that in sense experience pure being at once breaks up into the two theses, as we have called them, one this as I and one as object. When we reflect on this distinction, it is seen that neither the one nor the other is merely immediate, merely is in sense certainty, but is at the same time mediated. I have the certainty through the other, viz., through the actual fact, and this again exists in that certainty through another, viz., through the I. It is not only we who make this distinction of essential truth and particular example, of essence and instance, immediacy and mediation. We find it in sense certainty itself, and it has to be taken up in the form in which it exists there, not as we have just determined it. One of them is put forward in it as existing in simple immediacy, as the essential reality, the object. The other, however, is put forward as the non-essential, as mediated, something which is not per se in the certainty, but there through something else, ego, a state of knowledge which only knows the object because the object is, and which can as well be as not be. The object, however, is the real truth, is the essential reality. It is quite indifferent to whether it is known or not. It remains and stands even though it is not known, while the knowledge does not exist if the object is not there. We have thus to consider as to the object, whether in point of fact it does exist in sense certainty itself, as such an essential reality as that certainty gives it out to be. Whether its meaning and notion, which is to be essential reality, corresponds to the way it is present in that certainty. We have for that purpose not to reflect about it and ponder what it might be in truth, but to deal with it merely as sense certainty contains it. Sense certainty itself has thus to be asked: what is the this? If we take it in the twofold form of its existence, as the now and as the here, the dialectic it has in it will take a form as intelligible as the this itself. To the question, what is the now? We reply, for example, the now is nighttime. To test the truth of this certainty of sense, a simple experiment is all we need. Write that truth down. A truth cannot lose anything by being written down, and just as little by our preserving and keeping it. If we look again at the truth we have written down, look at it now. At this noontime, we shall have to say it has turned stale and become out of date. The now that is night is kept fixed. That is, it is treated as what it is given out to be, as something which is. But it proves to be rather as something which is not. The now itself no doubt maintains itself, but as what is not night. Similarly, in its relation to the day which the now is at present, it maintains itself as something that is also not day, or as altogether something negative. This self, maintaining now, is therefore not something immediate, but something mediated. For qua something that remains and preserves itself, it is determined through and by means of the fact that something else, namely day and night, is not. Thereby, it is just as much as ever it was before, now. And in being this simple fact, it is indifferent to what is still associated with it. Just as little as night or day is its being, it is just as truly also day and night. It is not in the least affected by this otherness through which it is what it is. A simple entity of this sort, which is by and through negation, which is neither this nor that, which is a not this, and with equal indifference this as well as that. A thing of this kind we call a universal. The universal is therefore in point of fact the truth of sense certainty, the true content of sense experience. The thought which may first occur to us in the history of philosophy is that the subject itself contains an inner contradiction. For philosophy aims at understanding what is unchangeable, eternal, in and for itself. Its end is truth. But history tells us of that which has at one time existed, at another time has vanished, having been expelled by something else. Truth is eternal. It does not fall within the sphere of the transient and has no history. But if it has a history, and as this history is only the representation of a succession of past forms of knowledge, the truth is not to be found in it, for the truth cannot be what has passed away. It might be said that all this argument would affect not only the other sciences, but in like degree the Christian religion, and it might be found inconsistent that a history of this religion and of the other sciences should exist. But it would be superfluous further to examine this argument, for it is immediately contradicted by the very fact that there are such histories. But in order to get a better understanding of this apparent contradiction, we must distinguish between the outward history of a religion or a science and the history of the subject itself. And then we must take into account that the history of philosophy, because of the special nature of its subject matter, is different from other histories. It is at once evident that the contradiction in question could not refer to the outward history, but merely to the inward, or that of the content itself. There is a history of the spread of Christianity and of the lives of those who have avowed it, and its existence has formed itself into that of a church. This in itself constitutes an external existence, such that being brought into contact with temporal affairs of the most diverse kind, its lot is a varied one, and it essentially possesses a history. And of the Christian doctrine, it is true that it too has its history, but it necessarily soon reached its full development and attained to its appointed powers. And this old creed has been an acknowledged influence to every age, and will still be acknowledged unchanged as the truth, even though this acknowledgement will become no more than a pretense, and the words an empty form. But the history of this doctrine in its wider sense includes two elements. First, the various additions to and deviations from the truth formally established, and secondly, the combating of these errors, the purification of the principles that remain from such additions, and a consequent return to their first simplicity. The other sciences, including philosophy, have also an external history like religion. Philosophy has a history of its origin, diffusion, maturity, decay, revival, a history of its teachers, promoters, and of its opponents, often, too, of an outward relation to religion and occasionally to the state. This side of its history likewise gives occasion to interesting questions. Amongst other such, it is asked why philosophy, the doctrine of absolute truth, seems to have revealed itself on the whole to a small number of individuals, to special nations, and how it has limited itself to particular periods of time. Similarly, with respect to Christianity, to the truth in a much more universal form than the philosophical, a difficulty has been encountered in respect to the question whether there is a contradiction in the fact that this religion should have appeared so late in time, and that it should have remained so long and should still remain limited to special races of men. But these and other similar questions are too much a matter of detail to depend merely on the general conflict referred to. And when we have further touched upon the peculiar character of philosophic knowledge, we may go more specially into the aspects which relate to the external existence and external history of philosophy. But as regards the comparison between the history of religion and that of philosophy as to inner content, there is not in the latter, as there is in religion, a fixed and fundamental truth, which, as unchangeable, is apart from history. The content of Christianity, which is truth, has, however, remained unaltered as such, and has therefore little history or as good as none. Hence, in religion, on account of its very nature as Christianity, the conflict referred to disappears. The errors and additions constitute no difficulty. They are transitory and altogether historical in character. The other sciences, indeed, have also, according to their content, a history, a part of which relates to alterations and the renunciation of tenets which were formerly current. But a great, perhaps the greater part of the history, relates to what has proved permanent, so that what was new was not an alteration on earlier acquisitions, but an addition to them. These sciences progress through a process of juxtaposition. It is true that in botany, mineralogy, and so on, much is dependent on what was previously known, but by far the greatest part remains stationary, and by means of fresh matter is merely added to without itself being affected by the addition. With a science like mathematics, history has, in the main, only the pleasing task of recording further additions. Thus, to take an example, elementary geometry, insofar as it was created by Euclid, may from his time on be regarded as having no further history. The history of philosophy, on the other hand, shows neither the motionlessness of a complete simple content, nor altogether the onward movement of a peaceful addition of new treasures to those already acquired. It seems merely to afford the spectacle of ever-recurring changes in the whole, such as finally are no longer even connected by a common aim. At this point appear these ordinary superficial ideas regarding the history of philosophy, which have to be referred to and corrected. As regards these very current views, which are doubtless known to you, gentlemen, for indeed they are the reflections most likely to occur in one's first crude thoughts on a history of philosophy, I will shortly explain what requires explanation, and the explanation of the differences in philosophies will lead us further into the matter itself. History, at the first glance, includes in its aim the narration of the accidental circumstances of times, of races, and of individuals, treated impartially partly as regards their relation in time and partly as to their content. The appearance of contingency in time succession is to be dealt with later on. It is contingency of content which is the idea with which we have first to deal, the idea of contingent actions. But thoughts and not external actions or griefs or joys form the content of philosophy. Contingent thoughts, however, are nothing but opinions, and philosophical opinions are opinions relating to the more special content of philosophy, regarding God, nature, and spirit. Thus, we now meet the view very usually taken of the history of philosophy, which ascribes to it the narration of a number of philosophical opinions as they have arisen and manifested themselves in time. This kind of matter is in courtesy called opinions. Those who think themselves more capable of judging rightly call such a history a display of senseless follies, or at least of errors, made by men engrossed in thought and in mere ideas. This view is not only held by those who recognize their ignorance of philosophy. Those who do this acknowledge it, because that ignorance is, in common estimation, held to be no obstacle to giving judgment upon what has to do with the subject. For it is thought that anybody can form a judgment on its character and value without any comprehension of it whatever. But the same view is even held by those who write or have written on the history of philosophy. This history, considered only as the enumeration of various opinions, thus becomes an idle tale, or if you will, an erudite investigation. For erudition is, in the main, acquaintance with a number of useless things, that is to say, with that which has no intrinsic interest or value further than being known. Yet it is thought that profit is to be derived from learning the various opinions and reflections of other men. It stimulates the powers of thought and also leads to many excellent reflections. This signifies that now and then it occasions an idea, and its art thus consists in the spinning one opinion out of the other. If the history of philosophy merely represented various opinions in array, whether they be of God or of natural and spiritual things existent, it would be a most superfluous and tiresome science, no matter what advantage might be brought forward, as derived from such thought activity and learning. What can be more useless than to learn a string of bald opinions? And what more unimportant? Literary works, being histories of philosophy in the sense that they produce and treat the ideas of philosophy as if they were opinions, need be only superficially glanced at to find how dry and destitute of interest everything about them is. An opinion is a subjective conception, an uncontrolled thought, an idea which may occur to me in one direction or in another. An opinion is mine. It is in itself a universal thought which is existent in and for itself. But philosophy possesses no opinions, for there is no such thing as philosophical opinions. When we hear a man speaking of philosophical opinions, even though he be an historian of philosophy itself, we detect at once this want of fundamental education. Philosophy is the objective science of truth. It is science of necessity, conceiving knowledge, and neither opinion nor the spinning out of opinions. Consciousness has found its notion in the principle of utility, but that notion is partly an object still, partly for that very reason still a purpose, of which consciousness does not yet find itself to be immediately possessed. Utility is still a predicate of the object, not a subject, not its immediate and sole actuality. It is the same thing that appeared before when we found that self-existence, being for self, had not yet shown itself to be the substance of the remaining moments, a process by which the useful would be directly nothing else than the self of consciousness, and this latter thereby in its possession. This revocation of the form of objectivity which characterizes the useful has, however, already taken effect implicitly, and as the outcome of this imminent internal revolution, there comes to light the actual revolution of concrete actuality, the new mode of conscious life, absolute freedom. This is so because, in point of fact, there is here no more than an empty semblance of objectivity separating self-consciousness from actual possession. For in part, all the validity and permanence of the various specific members of the organization of the world of actuality and belief have as a whole returned into this simple determination, as into their ground and their indwelling spirit. In part, however, this organized world has nothing peculiarly its own left for itself. It is instead pure metaphysics, pure notion or knowledge of self-consciousness. That is to say, from the whole and complete being of the useful qua-object, consciousness recognizes that its inherent nature, its being in itself, is essentially a being for another. mere being in itself, since it is selfless, is ultimately and in truth a passive entity, or something that is for another self. The object, however, is present to consciousness in this abstract form of purely inherent being, of pure being in itself. For consciousness is the activity of pure insight, the separate moments of which take the pure form of notions. Self-existence, being for self, however, into which being for another returns, in other words, the self, is not a self of what is called object, a self all its own and different from the ego. For consciousness, qua pure insight, is not an individual self, over against which the object, in the sense of having a self all its own, could stand, but the pure notion, the gazing of the self into self, the literal and absolute seeing itself double. The certainty of itself is the universal subject, and its notion knowing itself is the essential being of all reality. If the useful was merely the shifting change of the moments, without returning into its own proper unity, and was still hence an object for knowledge to deal with, then it ceases to be this now. For knowing is itself the process and movement of those abstract moments. It is the universal self, the self of itself as well as of the object, and being universal, is the unity of this process, a unity that returns into itself. The present inquiry has for its subject matter aesthetic. It is a subject coextensive with the entire realm of the beautiful. More specifically described, its province is that of art, or rather, we should say, of fine art. For a subject matter such as this, the term aesthetic is no doubt not entirely appropriate, for aesthetic denotes more accurately the science of the senses or emotion. It came by its origins as a science, or rather, as something that to start with purported to be a branch of philosophy during the period of the school of Wolf. In other words, when works of art were generally regarded in Germany with reference to the feelings they were calculated to evoke, as for example the feelings of pleasure, admiration, fear, pity, and so forth. It is owing to the unsuitability, or, more strictly speaking, the superficiality of this term, that the attempt has been made by some to apply the name holistic to this science. Yet this also is clearly insufficient, inasmuch as the science here referred to does not investigate beauty in its general signification, but the beauty of art pure and simple. For this reason, we shall accommodate ourselves to the term aesthetic, all the more so as the mere question of nomenclature is for ourselves a matter of indifference. It has as such been provisionally accepted in ordinary speech, and we cannot do better than retain it. The term, however, which fully expresses our science, is philosophy of art, and with still more precision. In virtue of this expression, we at once exclude the beauty of nature from the scientific exposition of fine art. Such a limitation of our subject may very well appear, from a certain point of view, as an arbitrary boundary line, similar to that which every science is entitled to fix in the demarcation of its subject matter. We must not, however, understand the limitation of aesthetic to the beauty of art in this sense. We are accustomed, no doubt, in ordinary life to speak of a beautiful colour, a beautiful heaven, a beautiful stream, to say nothing of beautiful flowers, animals, and, above all, of beautiful human beings. Without entering now into the disputed question how far the quality of beauty can justly be predicated of such objects, and consequently the beauty of nature comes generally into competition with that of art, we are justified in maintaining categorically that the beauty of art stands higher than nature. For the beauty of art is a beauty begotten, a new birth of mind. And to the extent that spirit and its creations stand higher than nature and its phenomena, to that extent the beauty of art is more exalted than the beauty of nature. Indeed, if we regard the matter in its formal aspect, that is to say, according to the way it is there, any chance fancy that passes through anyone's head is of higher rank than any product of nature. For in every case, intellectual conception and freedom are inseparable from such a conceit. In respect to content, the sun appears to us an absolutely necessary constituent of actual fact, while the perverse fancy passes away as something accidental and evanescent. Nonetheless, in its own independent being, a natural existence such as the sun possesses no power of self-differentiation. It is neither essentially free nor self-aware. And, if we regard it in its necessary cohesion with other things, we do not regard it independently for its own sake, and consequently not as beautiful. Merely to maintain, in a general way, that mind and the beauty of art which originates therefrom stand higher than the beauty of nature is no doubt to establish next to nothing. The expression higher is obviously entirely indefinite. It still indicates the beauty of nature and art as standing juxtaposed in the field of conception, and emphasizes the difference as a quantitative and accordingly external difference. But in predicating of mind and its artistic beauty a higher place in contrast to nature, we do not denote a distinction which is merely relative. Mind and mind alone is pervious to truth, comprehending all in itself, so that all which is beautiful can only be veritably beautiful as partaking in this higher sphere and as begotten of the same. Regarded under this point of view, it is only a reflection of the beauty appurtenant to mind. That is, we have it under an imperfect and incomplete mode, and one whose substantive being is already contained in the mind itself. Thus we see that philosophy is system in development. The history of philosophy is the same, and this is the main point to be noted and the first principle to be dealt with in this treatise on that history. In order to make this evident, the difference in respect to the possible modes of manifestation must first be pointed out. That is to say, the progression of the various stages in the advance of thought may occur with the consciousness of necessity, in which case each in succession deduces itself, and this form and this determination can alone emerge. Or else it may come about without this consciousness, as does a natural and apparently accidental process. So that while inwardly, indeed, the notion brings about its result consistently, this consistency is not made manifest. This is so in nature. In the various stages of the development of twigs, leaves, blossom and fruit, each proceeds for itself. But the inward idea is the directing and determining force which governs the progression. This is also so with the child whose bodily powers, and above all whose intellectual activities, make their appearance one after the other, simply and naturally, so that those parents who form such an experience for the first time marvel whence all that is now showing itself from within comes from. For the whole of these manifestations merely have the form of a succession in time. The one kind of progression which represents the deduction of the forms, the necessity thought out and recognized of the determinations, is the business of philosophy. And because it is the pure idea which is in question, and not yet its mere particularized form as nature and as mind, that representation is, in the main, the business of logical philosophy. But the other method, which represents the part played by the history of philosophy, shows the different stages and moments in development in time, in manner of occurrence, in particular places, in particular people or political circumstances, the complications arising thus, and in short, it shows us the empirical form. This point of view is the only one worthy of this science. From the very nature of the subject, it is inherently the true one. And through the study of this history, it will be made manifest that it actually shows and proves itself so. I have just recently spoken of the notion of the end. Yet by that we must not merely think of the form of the end as it is in us, in conscious beings. At first, end, in as far as I have it, is my conception, which is for itself, and the realization of which depends on my wish. If I carry it out, and if I am not unskillful, the object produced must be conformable to the end, containing nothing but it. There is a transition from subjectivity to objectivity, through which this opposition is always again sublated. Because I am discontented with my end in that it is only subjective, My activity consists in removing this defect and making it objective. In objectivity, the end has retained itself. For instance, if I have the end in view of building a house and am active for that end, the house results in which my end is realized. But we must not, as we usually do, abide at the conception of this subjective end. In this case, both I and the end exist independently and externally in relation to each other. In the conception that God, as wisdom, rules the world in accordance with an end, for instance, the end is posited for itself in a wise, figuratively conceiving being. But the universal of end is the fact that since it is a determination independently fixed that rules present existence, the end is the truth, the soul of a thing. The good in the end gives content to itself, so that while it is active with this content, and after it has entered into externality, no other content comes forth than what was already present. The best example of this is presented in life. It has desires, and these desires are its ends. As merely living, however, it knows nothing of these ends, but yet they are first, immediate determinations which are established. The animal works at satisfying these desires, that is, at reaching the end. It relates itself to external things, partly mechanically, partly chemically. But the character of its activity does not remain mechanical or chemical. The product is rather the animal itself, which, as its own end, brings forth in its activity only itself, since it negates and overturns those mechanical or chemical relationships. In mechanical and chemical process, on the other hand, the result is something different, in which the subject does not retain itself. But in the end, beginning and end are alike, for we posit the subjective objectively in order to receive it again. Self-preservation is a continual production by which nothing new, but always the old, arises. It is a taking back of activity for the production of itself. Thus, this self-determining activity, which is then active on something else, enters into opposition. But it again negates the opposition, governs it, and it reflects upon itself. It is the end, the thought, that which conserves itself in its self-determination. The development of these moments is the business of philosophy from henceforth. But if we look more closely as to how far Anaxagoras has got in the development of this thought, we find nothing further than the activity determining from out of itself, which sets up a limit or measure. Further than the determination of measure, development does not go. Anaxagoras gives us no more concrete definition of the nous, and this we are still left to consider. We thus have nothing more than the abstract determination of the concrete in itself. The above-mentioned predicates which Anaxagoras gives the no may thus indeed be affirmed, but they are, on their own account, one-sided only. Science, on the other hand, everyone must admit, is formally bound to occupy itself with thinking which abstracts from the mass of particulars. And for this very reason, from one point of view, the imagination and its contingency and caprice, in other words, the organ of artistic activity and enjoyment, is excluded from it. On the other hand, when art gives joyous animation to just this gloomy and arid dryness of the notion, bringing its abstractions and divisions into reconciliation with concrete fact, supplementing with its detail what is wanting to the notion in this respect, even in that case a purely contemplative reflection simply removes once more all that has been added, does away with it, conducting the notion once again to that simplicity denuded of positive reality which belongs to it and its shadowland of abstraction. It is also a possible contention that science in respect to content is concerned with what is essentially necessary. If our science of aesthetic places on one side natural beauty, not merely have we apparently made no advance, but rather separated ourselves yet further from what is necessary. The expression nature implies from the first the ideas of necessity and uniformity. That is to say, a constitution which gives every expectation of its proximity and adaptability to scientific inquiry. In mental operations generally, and most of all in the imagination, if contrasted in this respect with nature, caprice and superiority to every kind of formal restriction, caprice it is here assumed, is uniquely in its right place, and these at once put out of court the basis of a scientific inquiry. From each and all these points of view, consequently, in its origin, that is to say, in its effect and in its range, fine art, so far from proving itself fitted for scientific effort, rather appears fundamentally to resist the regulative principle of thought, and to be ill-adapted for exact scientific discussion. Difficulties of this kind, and others like them, which have been raised in respect to a thoroughly scientific treatment of fine art, have been borrowed from current ideas, points of view and reflection, the more systematic expansion of which we may read ad nauseam in previous literature, in particular French literature, upon the subject of beauty and the fine arts. Such contain to some extent facts which have their justification. In fact, elaborate arguments are deduced therefrom, which also are not without their tincture of apparent plausibility. In this way, for instance, there is the fact that the configuration of beauty is as multifold as the phenomenon of beauty is of universal extension, from which we may conclude, if we care to do so, that a universal impulse towards beauty is enclosed in our common nature, and may yet further conceivably infer that because the conceptions of beauty are so countless in their variety, and withal are obviously something particular, it is impossible to secure laws of universal validity, either relatively to beauty or our taste for it. The ethical order of the community found its destiny consummated, and its truth realized in the spirit that merely passed away within it, the individual self. This legal person, however, has its substance and its fulfillment outside the ethical order. The process of the world of culture and belief does away with this abstraction of a mere person. And by the completion of the process of estrangement, by reaching the extremity of abstraction, the self of spirit finds the substance become first the universal will, and finally its own possession. Here then, knowledge seems at last to have become entirely adequate to the truth at which it aims. For its truth is this knowledge itself. All opposition between the two sides has vanished, and that too not for us who are tracing the process, not merely implicitly, but actually for self-consciousness itself. That is to say, self-consciousness has itself got the mastery over the opposition which consciousness involves. This latter rests on the opposition between certainty of self and the object. Now, however, the object for it is the certainty of self-knowledge, just as the certainty of itself as such has no longer ends of its own, is no longer conditioned and determinate, but is pure knowledge. Self-consciousness thus now takes its knowledge to be the substance itself. This substance is for it at once immediate and absolutely mediated in one indivisible unity. It is immediate, just like the ethical consciousness it knows and itself does its duty, and is bound to its duty as to its own nature. But it is not character, as that ethical consciousness was, which in virtue of its immediacy is a determinate type of spirit, belongs merely to one of the essential features of ethical life, and has the characteristic of not being conscious explicit knowledge. It is, again, absolute mediation, like the consciousness developing itself through culture and like belief. For it is essentially the movement of the self to transcend the abstract form of immediate existence and become consciously universal, and yet to do so neither by simply estranging and rending itself as well as reality, nor by fleeing from it. Rather, it is for itself directly and immediately present in its very substance. For this substance is its knowledge. It is the pure certainty of self become transparently visible. And just this very immediacy, which constitutes its own actual reality, is the entire actuality. For the immediate is being, and qua pure immediacy, immediacy purified by thoroughgoing negativity. This immediacy is pure being, is being in general, is all being. Absolute essential being is therefore not exhausted by the characteristic of being the simple essence of thought. It is all actuality, and this actuality exists merely as knowledge. What consciousness did not know would have no sense, and can be no power in its life. Into its self-conscious knowing will, all objectivity, the whole world, has withdrawn. It is absolutely free in that it knows its freedom. And just this very knowledge of its freedom is its substance, its purpose, its sole and only content. In this conversation, Socrates' philosophy is found as also what is known as the Socratic method, which must in its nature be dialectic, and of which we must speak before dealing with the content. Socrates' manner is not artificial. The dialogues of the moderns, on the contrary, just because no internal reason justifies their form, are necessarily tedious and heavy. But the principle of his philosophy falls in with the method itself, which thus far cannot be called method, since it is a mode which quite coincides with the moralizing peculiar to Socrates. For the chief content is to know the good as the absolute, and that particularly in relation to actions. Socrates gives this point of view so high a place that he both puts aside the sciences, which involve the contemplation of the universal in nature, mind, and sea, himself, and calls upon others to do the same. Thus it can be said that in content his philosophy had an altogether practical aspect, and similarly the Socratic method, which is essential to it, was distinguished by the system of first bringing a person to reflection upon his duty by any occasion that might either happen to be offered spontaneously or that was brought about by Socrates, by going to the workplaces of tailors and shoemakers and entering into discourse with them, as also with youths and old men, sophists, statesmen and citizens of all kinds. He in the first place took their interests as his topic, whether these were household interests, the education of children, or the interests of knowledge or of truth. Then he led them on from a definite case to think of the universal, and of truths and beauties which had absolute value, since in every case, from the individual's own thoughts, he derived the conviction and consciousness of that which is the definite right. This method has two prominent aspects: the one the development of the universal from the concrete case, and the exhibition of the notion which implicitly exists in every consciousness. And the other is the resolution of the firmly established, and, when taken immediately in consciousness, universal determinations of the sensuous conception or of thought, and the causing of confusion between these and what is concrete. If we proceed from the general account of Socrates' method to a nearer view, in the first place, its effect is to inspire men with distrust towards their presuppositions, after faith had become wavering and they were driven to seek that which is in themselves. Now, whether it was that he wished to bring the manner of the sophist into disrepute, or that he was desirous to awaken the desire for knowledge and independent thought in the youths whom he attracted to himself, he certainly began by adopting the ordinary conceptions which they considered to be true. But in order to bring others to express these, he represents himself as in ignorance of them, and with a seeming ingenuousness, puts questions to his audience as if they were to instruct him, while he really wished to draw them out. This is the celebrated Socratic irony, which in his case is a particular mode of carrying on intercourse between one person and another, and is thus only a subjective form of dialectic, for real dialectic deals with the reasons for things. What he wished to effect was that when other people brought forward their principles, he from each definite proposition should deduce as its consequence the direct opposite of what the proposition stated, or else allow the opposite to be deduced from their own inner consciousness, without maintaining it directly against their statements. Sometimes he also derived the opposite from a concrete case. But as this opposite was a principle held by men as firmly as the other, he then went on to show that they contradicted themselves. Thus Socrates taught those with whom he associated to know that they knew nothing. Indeed, what is more, he himself said that he knew nothing, and therefore taught nothing. It may actually be said that Socrates knew nothing, for he did not reach the systematic construction of a philosophy. He was conscious of this, and it was also not at all his aim to establish a science. On the one view, this irony seems to be something untrue. But when we deal with objects which have a universal interest and speak about them to one and to another, it is always the case that one does not understand another's conception of the object.